You're listening to the Culturing Podcast. That's Culture E-I-N-G, where we believe that healthy company culture is the untapped fuel to growth in your organization. By taking action today on building an amazing workplace environment, you're setting yourself up for an unstoppable, thriving future that will put you on the map and propel you to prosperity. This is your host, Tynan Allen. So come on, let's get culturing. Now, this is a hot button topic and is so important to the marketplace. Rockson is a writer and a speaker. He's even a consultant and media personality, owning a company called UYD Management. Now, they focus on strategic leadership and help to organizations to incorporate sustainable diversity and inclusion practices. So he's someone that you really want to pay attention to. I definitely recommend that you follow up with him after this episode if anything he says to you really stands out. And I'm excited because what he's talking about is he's not talking about the fluff of diversity and inclusion, but rather the hard, practical things that you can do in your organization to really shift the tide in this space. So get alert, put away everything you're doing if you can, and take some notes because there's going to be some powerful, important information for you to take away and apply in your workplace. So today on the podcast, we have Rockson. How are you doing, buddy?
Fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm good. So I love that you are, this young person who is absolutely taking the world of diversity and inclusion by storm. You might not think of yourself that way, but I see it and other people are seeing it. I think you're living in a bit of disbelief right now. You just spoke at Work Human, which is one of the preeminent conferences for people, culture, and human resources. So congratulations to you on that. I'm so proud of you. I'm excited for your career.
Thank you.
Tell us about that experience. What were you speaking about at Work Human, and kind of give us the behind the scenes of what do you believe as you were going into that space?
Well, thank you first of all for those kind of words, and hi everybody. At Work Human, I was speaking on how to connect effectively, which has become the thing that I've started to speak about very, very often. It's my signature speech. It's what the book I'm talking about later on is on, and I was really talking about how to essentially connect in divisive times. I feel like a lot of people sort of separate work from the real life or the real world environments. And it's no secret, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of world events leak into the workplace,
right.
Whether it's Me Too, whether it's the recent elections here, whether it's Brexit, whether it's immigration, all these things factor into, human resource, HR, people, how we relate to people, how we see others, how we compartmentalize, how we parent. And so I went through a speech that really broke down 3 ways in which people can improve on how to, how they, humanize people,
right.
and how they improve their cultural competency.
Yep.
So obviously the goal of that is obviously to make sure that leaders are more mindful of attracting the type of people they want to attract, but also they're mindful of whether they're perpetuating systemic inequality.
And so, where's the best place for a leader to start when they are looking at this big issue of diversity and inclusion? I mean, we're going to deep dive into this. This is kind of where we're going with this episode, because it's so important. Mm-hmm. And yet I think we can all agree that we've got a lot of work to do to really be up to snuff on this topic. And, there is no really great standard across the board in organizations when it comes to this topic. And I think a lot of HR leaders are kind of struggling. They don't know where to start. So what has been the thing that you're seeing that leaders that are doing this well, where do they start? And what would your recommendations be for other leaders that are getting going?
Well, I'll talk about both of them. And the best place for leaders to start is with themselves. I think a leader needs to address his or her biases and understand his or her value, right? If you don't understand your value system and what your biases are, you're not even going to know where there's room for growth, room for improvement, or what your potential vision could be. So with your bias, everybody, we all have it, so it doesn't necessarily make you racist or bigoted or any ism, but it does hold the clues to why you think the way you think and why you react to things the way you think. So the way you do. So understanding those at first will definitely give you an insight into maybe you shaping the company to your bias, as well as your values. Do you have personal values and do you have company values? Is your company consistently, in alignment with those values that you set? A lot of people, when they're in the growth stage, especially fast growing startups, they just focus on the growth and they lose sight of what they initially wanted the company to look, to look for, because it's profits. It's, we need to raise this money. We need to raise this round of investment. And you forget, oh, we hired 2 people. They look the same. And this is a redundancy. Oh, that person is just Jack. That's just Jill. That's how they are. And then that multiplies, and those Jack and Jill become the leaders that then set the unwritten cultures. So are you staying in alignment with that? And once you do those things, you start to know where you can hire for culture add, right? Maybe, hey, we want to continue to grow this type of culture. Let's see if we can bring more type of people that cause us to think this way and cause us to be more independent thinkers as opposed to group thinkers when it comes to these things. So a lot of CEOs don't. And then when they finally get to that point where they realize there's a problem, sometimes leaders feel like if they stay quiet, it'll go away. Or if they pass it off to someone, it'll go away. But that can only go so far. If it's led from middle management, at some point the ceiling will reach. And then if it's not really affirmed by a leader, it will be, it'll fall down the wayside. It'll become too much work for someone. It'll become, fluff. So I would say start with themselves, understand where their biases are, which leads to room for improvement, but also understand your values, which allows you to create a vision statement and something that your other employees can aspire to.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you on this a bit, because what we keep seeing is that people set up these values, they set up these vision statements. That's sometimes not even the issue for people. They have that stuff written on the wall, but then they come back to still what you're describing, this problem of, creating duplicates of themselves and then having this sort of group think that doesn't actually have a diverse and inclusive environment, as part of its DNA. So how do we take that vision and value statements and all of that stuff and actually make sure that we stay on track instead of just being something on the wall?
So if you listen to what you just said, you said some people have the vision statements and they still have the same problems. What you said is they're not living out their vision statement or their value statement. So it's one thing to put something on a wall. It's one thing to say something during orientation, but it's another thing to live it out. It's another thing to include that in your, compensation, and another thing to include that when you're calling out people for bad behaviors. Do you actually have a protocol for that? It's another thing to make sure that in your recruitment and your hiring and in everything that involves people services, you have these things affirmed and reaffirmed. Do and you can have those things there, but if you don't have a plan in action, do you have a diversity council? Do you have ERGs? Do you have weekly reports? Do you, as the CEO, say, hey, this is our great, I always encourage this for all my clients, to have to collectively determine what A, B, C, D, F, like a letter grade, looks like. We're going to be at A if this is what's happening right now, or B if this is what's happening, C if this is what happened, D is what happened. And then periodically throughout the year, every 3 months or so, you check in to see how you're doing with that. And so that's one way. But the other thing is, to your other point where you brought up about you still hire the same sort of people, if you're not really checking your biases, and I'm not a fan of just doing a canned approach, oh, we did unconscious bias training, we're done. I'm saying understand, create a safe environment where people from different backgrounds can have and feel like they can be themselves. So after the elections, for example, I got probably one of the most calls I've ever had. I got a series of calls because people couldn't come to the office because some people felt betrayed by their colleagues because they voted for Trump, or others felt otherwise. So how can you have that type of conversation where people can tell you how they see other people, and how can you make sure that that's not making its way into the hiring? So if you don't create a place for safe dialogue or open dialogue, you're going to continue to have the same problems, because people will retreat and hide things to themselves. But it really just we talk about, we're in the business of people, make people feel like they're people. And that's the basics of that. And I understand how that can seem cliche, but a lot of people do the cliche thing, put it up there, they don't actually live it out. And it can show when you don't do that, very obviously.
Totally. So I love just watching you and how you describe it. You started to list off a bunch of things that people do, right? You say diversity council, and you started to say that as if this list of things that people can do was normal. But let's be honest, this is not something people know about. This is something that we still have a lot of room to grow in. It's probably the most underdeveloped, segment of our HR departments, which is that diversity diversity and inclusion branch, or however you do it in your company. If it's a small company, there's probably not anyone that focuses on it other than just everybody saying, I guess we're going to be nice to each other. So can you take us into that, right? If most people have never really heard of a diversity council, what is that? What are these things that you listed off that we really need in our organizations that are going to make sure that we don't go down the road of kind of creating minions of one another?
No, absolutely. So I'll give you an example. You did a great job of highlighting how when it's a small company, there's probably a bit of redundancy. So someone is doing HR and recruiting and all that at the same time. But what makes a diversity council effective? A diversity council must be, intimately linked to both the overall diversity initiative and the business strategy. Right. So I always say senior leadership must be involved to support the process. There should be clear delineation of the roles and responsibilities, and there should be representative membership. And a lot of what they do is essentially there are a bunch of people who have either been elected or self-appointed as people that will make sure that they continuously are keeping the company in check, making sure that that the leadership is held accountable for what the diversity goals are, and also making sure that people at the entry level and middle management level feel supported, feel heard, right? So they advocate for personal concerns relating to issues of inclusion. They also, sometimes they can substitute for critical role leadership when it involves diversity and inclusion processes. But the downfall is when you just make it a complaint system. Like if how sometimes when you have a group of people that you just meet in the office and all you do is complain about this is the problem with this person, this is the problem with this person. Or if you just make them the only responsible owners of the diversity process, that can feel like a drain. So it really has to be represented. But yeah, I mean, that's really what it is. It's self-appointed or elected. And they do a lot of things like allocating the budget, setting the council agenda, determining what the calendar for the year is going to be like, and actually helping with the 1 to the 2 to the 5 year diversity hiring practices.
Yeah. So let's go into diversity hiring. Like what are some things out there that can really help people with this? Maybe it's a technology that you might recommend, or maybe it's sort of best practices that people should start to put into place in their organizations. Like you don't want to just have numbers for numbers' sake. And that's, I think, where people kind of struggle is they're like, well, we don't want to just only have people. We want the right people. And how do we kind of navigate those waters?
Sure. I mean, the first thing companies don't do, it's funny, we talk about self-awareness a lot. I don't think a lot of companies keep an eye on their employee, right? We have sites like Glassdoor or other sites that will tell you, how people see your company, or maybe even just doing a search on your company on social media, you can see certain things. So some people don't even know where they're starting. They don't know what they're perceived as. And a simple thing will be looking at those sites like Glassdoor, but also checking your website and having people from different backgrounds. Do they feel like it's representative, it's inclusive? Is there language in your job boards that sort of hints at one type of person? Only Ivy Leaguers, for example, or do people that are not in college feel like they can join or apply for your things? Those subtle things. Is it gender neutral? That's the simplest of things. Keep an eye on your employer brand. And then also, whenever you're hiring for diversity and inclusion, the importance of having a diversity council is you can then check with the council to see, hey, we're lacking in engineering. We have 0 to little representation here. This is what we need to check. These are what the people are saying, and this is the temperature of the company. You could also run internal events, that talk about, diversity and inclusion, whether it's company-wide events based to discuss why you're prioritizing. You could host or sponsor, university or college or internship programs in specific areas, right? So you could partner up with clubs, schools that are affinity-based, and really announce that this is what you want to do, and this is why you're actually tapping into talent pool, but you see it as a big part of the goal. I also always encourage companies to publicly promote their wins, because that communicates to people like, hey, I could be included into that, right? And I think if you find affinity groups or alignment groups, whether it's girls who tech or girls who code rather, and things like that, those things help make your job easier. Then that PR allows you to seek you out, searching for jobs. Then it doesn't. It also cuts your cost when you're actually starting. You don't have to worry about spending extra money if your CEO is using money as an excuse not to recruit for diversity. But those are just some simple things. And other things are obviously based on the company, and it depends on the uniqueness of that. Because some people do have diversity, but they don't have inclusion. A lot of multinationals fall into this category where they're like, you have companies and people from different backgrounds, but when you look at the lunch times, they're all sitting in the area. This country group sits with this country, that country, and then there's no inclusion. So, it has to be very, very. It depends on what the company culture already.
Let's go into that. I want to talk more about inclusion, because I saw something recently that sort of said, inclusion is the thing that actually takes and applies diversity. That diversity is about the numbers and really making sure that you do have, more equal representation across races, across genders, all that sort of stuff. But then you have the kind of applied version, which is that inclusion. Not only that you just have, somebody that's a different color than you that works with you, but you actually listen to them and you hear their voice and you understand that they think differently and process things differently. But, how do people do this? Because you're right, this is that culture piece. This is not just something that you can check the box off of, but it's something you have to live and breathe. So, let's dive into that. What can people do to really make sure they're including and listening to one another?
Well, all hands meetings, first of all, a lot of times. I think the benefit of that is, if you set a rule where you basically say, sometimes people don't talk because they fear being fired, right? Fear of consequence. So that culture has to be established at first where, hey, this is what we want. We will encourage this type of dialogue. If you feel like you're not being heard, seen, or understood in any way, please let us know. It's really not gonna come across as you being disrespectful. You'd be surprised how many times that simple fear of being fired has come, especially with all the companies I consult with. Whenever I talk and do surveys, they always say, well, I don't want to get fired. I just want to keep my job. I just got this. I have this. And so finding a way to do that, to make sure, sharing that will be beneficial. ERGs, having people, whether it's, if you have a large company with different people from different backgrounds, make them feel like they can bring their whole selves to the workplace. And so encourage them to say, hey, what are your important holidays? Have that go around every beginning of the year or every time you hire. Have everyone from every different background share what the important holidays are. Find that in a lot of Western countries, a lot of the times off are related to Western religions. You and I are Christian, but we wouldn't probably feel a lot of this, but a lot of people are not Christian. A lot of people didn't grow up the same way. And so when they feel like this is geared towards something else, whether it's because it's normalized, it's a problem. Having potlucks, for example, all these things are subtle things, by the way. Potlucks, and using those potlucks to, like, maybe it's Friday lunches, but that's an example for someone to bring something from their culture and then share about, the origins of all those simple things that people get to say, wow, that's you, that's real, that's what you do. It's a good way to get people to humanize each other and to feel included. Have each of these different groups also, whether you want to set up referral systems, have them, host events at their own schools or their own alma maters, and empower them basically to be able to say, hey, if you're able to get as many of these people from your alma mater, this is how it's going to be impact referrals. Just include them in the whole process. That's what inclusion really is. It's including them and empowering, and not just saying, hey, you come to work, you do this, you go home, right? Because we work for most of our lives. So it's almost ridiculous to think and expect people not to bring at least, expect an overlap, but at least not bring a section of themselves outside the work. And to close, I'll say this. This was one story that highlights this. There was a lady, two of them actually. One lady that I worked with, I remember she would not show her pictures, because her pictures with her partners, she's lesbian, and the reason she didn't show her pictures is because people around the office were in very hetero sexual relationships, and so she didn't feel like she could bring herself. And her and I, we got into conversation, and because I knew her off work, I was like, wait, why do you always, how come you never bring someone you bring your partner to your events? And she said, well, if I bring this, people will talk, and that's going to affect my bottom line. Now, I don't know if the company knew that, but that's what was perceived. And then another lady at the same company was wearing a hijab, but after a terrorist attack, I can't remember where, she contemplated, she didn't do it, but she contemplated taking off her hijab because the looks that she was getting. These things are not discussed, but they should be discussed, and they affect everyone else. And so those are just the subtle things that people to do. And that's what HR, and that's what you and my responsibility is. And that's what a CEO, an executive, should be looking to take the temperature. So
it sounds to me like, two things that people can do that are in leadership roles or or within HR, just, any person at the workplace is to start to call some of these things out, right? That a lot of leaders, I'm sure that in their heart, they don't have anything against somebody like that, right? Like somebody that's different than them, they don't necessarily think like you're going to get fired. I would fire you if you brought your, girlfriend to this party.
Of course.
But they maybe have not said the opposite. They've never actually said that we actually want, no matter who you are, to bring everyone that whoever your significant other is, bring them to the party. If that's not actually said, then the opposite might be perceived. So that's something that I think a lot of people struggle to do, is to even identify what they should say, because they, on the other hand, are assuming, well, they're a nice person. They smile at everyone. So then they assume that they've created this safe place. But actually, the safe place isn't there, and they don't realize it.
That's why I said, when you ask me what should leaders start off with, it's with themselves. We all have, like I said, we all have the way we see the world, biases and all that kind of stuff. And the fact is, we live in a heteronormative where, what's considered normal on TV is a couple is, what typical man and woman, or all these type of things. Or, when you see someone from the Muslim faith, you say some people start to feel a certain way. Be mindful of that. It doesn't just exist outside of your workplace. And I have this conversation with many CEOs to your point earlier. They feel like, oh, that's just outside. That's not, I don't want to bring that in. Then I tell them the people you're hiring are the people you're essentially ostracized. And that's a privilege that you have for you to say you don't have to worry about it, because other people have to worry about that when they come here or when they're moving to the place. And so it's on you, as well as whoever's in leadership team, to create a safe environment. That's really what inclusion is, honestly. Because I wrote this earlier. I don't know if you saw this, but diversity to me is linking the visible to the invisible. Too many people think of diversity as just like you and I, people of color and religion or whatever. But a lot of it is in here, right? Do you have, it's about ableism, mental health, things you can't, and those things you can't see are the things that people don't factor in when they do diversity training. They do the easy, visible things, but you don't take time to understand the invisible. Are there stigmas around those invisible things? And are there places for people to talk about those invisible things so they can feel like they're still part?
Totally. I love that we have sirens in the background. You're in New York City,
sorry,
right?
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
You're like, I don't even hear it anymore.
It's so funny. I didn't even think. I'm so used to this. You're like recording a podcast. You're like, oh man, this guy. Oh God. I'm like, oh yeah, sorry. Did I happen?
I did not expect anyone to have a soundproof room. That would be too much. But let's go into, you immigrated from, is it Nigeria? Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I'm actually still in Nigerian citizen. I have what you call an O1. This is their words. It's a visa for aliens with extraordinary abilities. They call it.
Wow, I love that.
So actors, entrepreneurs, or people with unique skill sets. Sometimes you get special. But yes, I'm
okay.
100%.
Okay, so tell us about that experience. What are you seeing across the board when it comes to people that are immigrating or transplanting themselves in a different culture? What does a leader need to know about somebody that's not just diverse, but is also from another country? What are some key things that they should be looking out for in terms of how to include them better?
So that's a great question, because I'm Nigerian, and obviously I don't sound Nigerian to so many people, but that's because I grew up in 5 countries and 4 continents. So throughout my life, I've been living in between or in the intersections of different cultures, and people react to me based on what they see. I remember being this skinny Nigerian kid when I was 10 years old, skinny Nigerian kid with a thick Nigerian accent in a French-speaking country, American international school, going through puberty. And I remember one of the kids, it was a white boy. He didn't know it. He was I think it was maybe 11 at the time, and he came to me and started laughing at my hair. He pointed it out and said, "Why does your hair curl that way? It looks so weird." And I remember me thinking, I ran home after school. I was like, "Mom, I need to straighten my hair." And this is a 10-year-old. This is what I was thinking about. And my mom she had to explain to me. She had to tell me what my about my course and hair texture. And that was the beginning of me understanding Black. But then speaking of Black, I then came to America and I realized that, obviously in Nigeria, most of us are, you just identify by your tribes different. Here, I was, it's always pointed out in America, like you're this, you're that, you're that. They would tell me, "Oh, you must be African American." I'm like, "No, I'm African, but I'm not American." No, but you're African. Yeah, I'm Black, but I'm not African American. But you can't be Black and not African. We'll be having these discussions. I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Black, but I'm not African American. I'm from Nigeria." And then they're like, "What? There's no way you're Nigerian. I mean, your English is so good." And I'm like, "What?" It's like, but yeah, your English is so good. And I'm like, and then it would ask me if I lived in huts. This is arguments I had with teachers, roommates, and stuff like that. And it became so apparent to me, and this is where the seeds of this work I do were planted, that many people only know what they know, or whatever they see on TV or whatever they've heard, that informs their world. And so as I was applying for jobs, I started to see how people treated internationals. Like if you have a different name that they're not used to, sometimes it causes this trepidation in companies because they feel like your English is good. And so that's going to be a bigger learning curve. They don't want to have to deal with that. Another thing that it could be a fear for a company sometimes is about visas. Like, do we have to sponsor a visa? What's the process like? And they're like, well, I'll just rather not deal with it. So these are just things that people come with where they feel like if you're from another culture, you might not have the cultural competence or the normal competence to do the work. And it, once again, all goes back to people's biases and things like that. But I found myself being confusing to many people because maybe they read my first name, Tayo, short for Akintayo, which means a warrior's brother's joy. So they read the first name and they were like, I wasn't expecting, these are actual interviews. I wasn't expecting, your English to be so good. And I'm like, what? I don't know if you should be telling me this, but it happens all the time. And me in private moments, I talked to a lot of recruiters. I had this conversation with a recruiter who told me, hey, so normally what I do to get paid quickly is I look at the LinkedIn profile. I usually check to see if the person is good looking. And then I look to see, if they had stable career. So at least 2 years, 2 years here, 2 years there. Then I look at the school. The school is a relatively respectable school. I just send apply. And I asked them, hey, won't you check other people? You're like, oh no, that's just, that's the easiest way. I'm like, but what about people from different backgrounds? It's like, well, that's why I want to talk to you because you look different. So you could help me do that. And I was like, no, that's your job. And he said, no, I want to be able to do mine because it's going to get me paid quickly. But if you and they see you, it will help. And then I was like, but that's the problem. And what you're asking me to do is actually going to make me your biggest competitor because I'm talking about how you shouldn't do what you're doing. And you're trying to just have me, because I look the way I look, solve your problem, which you're not even actively trying to solve. That's what happens a lot in the hiring circle. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why people don't get into the, international or immigration to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I completely understand. I mean, we all have a lot of work to do. I was just in the United States and I met somebody who didn't know that Canada bordered the United States. So
no, stop it.
It literally happened and I was very shocked. And this is not a knock on America because I'm actually half American. But
you half American?
Yeah, my dad's from Houston. So
I don't know. I thought you were full Canadian. All right,
yeah,
Drake.
By blood, I'm America, but I've never lived there. But it's interesting that we do have to give people the benefit of the doubt, right? People are not doing this because they're horrible people. They just have not been taught. They've not learned this, and I think that I go into every situation that discusses diversity, discusses inclusion, discusses where we all come from and how different we are, with the understanding that I just have a different background and I've had to deal with more of this stuff than other people have. And it's not their fault, but we do have to be open and we do have to learn and we do have to be excited to work and grow at this together. What I want to talk about is also when this is happening, what's the best way to call somebody out on it? Because I think that's a lot of the time an issue. If you are a leader and you're seeing something, you might not know how to challenge someone at that.
Yeah.
You might not have the right words or the right conversation starters to open this up for discussion in your organization. Can you kind of take us into what almost like a mock conversation would sound like if you are somebody in the organization that notices that you have a diversity problem and an inclusion problem and you want to start to have more conversations about changing that? Like what can you say that to stop somebody in their tracks, but do it in a nice way almost?
So are you asking about how to react to microaggressions and then how to act in an office and say, hey, CEO, we have a diversity problem? Because those are two different things.
Let's talk about both then. Yeah, let's do that.
So this microaggression thing is always very interesting. I always frame it into a critical thinking approach. So when someone asks me your English is just so good. And I was like, well, you're a pretty smart person. Who do you think we were colonized by? Like, you understand these are. And then I'll basically give them, we were colonized by United Kingdom. And like, oh, wow, is that happened? Yes, the same sort of thing that happened. The reason why you're here, where immigrants came here, that happened elsewhere, where people basically got the different culture. And then a lot of times, sometimes when people start to see that realization, they're like, oh, that's crazy. Or if someone says, can I touch your hair? Like, why can I touch your hair? You having them to ask the same question. And then, or if someone asks me, because this is someone, I want to use the N-word. Why can't I use the N-word around you? And then I ask, why do you want to use the N-word? Just simple why. Have them explain why they want to do that. And as they start to explain, it becomes more ridiculous. Because if someone's explaining why they want to use the N-word, for example, we're like, well, it's because, okay, keep going. And then that kind of thing, it's always like that. Or another thing is just to say, hey, that makes me feel uncomfortable. I really don't appreciate. There are moments when you can, especially when it gets disrespectful, I really don't appreciate having to do this, or having you say that in the workplace. And I appreciate it. It's really okay. And another thing, sometimes if it really gets extreme, is that's when you walk away. As far as you do it in an organizational format, it can be tricky, especially if you're subordinate and you notice this. And so I find the middle managers have the most visibility almost in a company. They're the ones that are talking to upper management, and they sort of know how to, they manage what's going on down here or in the subordinates. So if you can find or establish rapport with a middle manager that you feel comfortable with, frame it in a conversation where it actually speaks to the way you work, your productivity. And sometimes, obviously this is case by case, it really doesn't make me feel like I can bring my full self, like I see myself in leadership, or there's a path for me to grow because of all these things. And I don't know if you've noticed, but this is what I noticed and all that kind of stuff. So finding that ally can help. If you're this is why I love the idea of diversity council, is if it's representative, it's going to include everyone from every level and every division in the company. So speaking up in that format wouldn't be seen as rude or you being a rebel. It would be like, oh, this is a problem. And so maybe instead of just finding a manager, if you can't find a manager, you build rapport, just suggest that, hey, could I help lead a diversity council? Could I help do that? And we'll make sure this diversity council brings up issues that you may not be privy to work, and we'll like to be able to report to you once a week or once a month or whatever if you do that. That's a subtle approach. And yeah, and then the other thing would be, ideally, you want your CEO to be vigilant. You don't want to get stuck in this reactive mindset where things are being reactive. And I've noticed that diversity and inclusion sometimes only ends up being about like skin color and all these things, but also think about ways to improve mental health. Think about harassment. All right, privilege that sometimes I know that men have is not knowing that, if you have like a dress code in the workplace, how it might be difficult to shop for women with different body types or different things, and expect that to do that. Or maybe just subtle statements or speaking over women in the workplace. All these things, have a system in place where you can have anonymous, surveys or things or complaints that can be sent on a collective basis, so that people can understand that, hey, this is a problem, we should check this out, and have someone, check it out. Maybe someone from leadership, someone from HR, keep an eye on things that fall through the cracks, and making sure that there's a complaint or there's a formal process for you to file a grievance. So, that's how it really starts, honestly.
Awesome. Okay, so to wrap up, I want you to talk a little bit about your new book, Use Your Difference to Make a Difference. And how did that come to be? And then, what sort of is your biggest takeaway for leaders from your book?
Biggest takeaway from the book, I say I break down 3 ways that we can connect effectively across cultures. And I say it's educate, don't perpetuate, instead communicate, right? And so education for me is 2-pronged. It's education of self and education of the environment. And it involves, IQ, EQ, and CQ. So EQ is emotional intelligence, CQ is culture intelligence, moving beyond just to know. And education of self, we've talked a lot about it. It's just getting more aware of what your biases or your values are, so that you know where to start and where to improve and how to stay consistent with your higher self. So that connection to self allows you to separate context from personal opinion. And then education of environment involves learning how to collect and gather information about people that you know much about, and then becoming active listeners. A lot of us listen to confirm, but we don't listen to hear. And then the other part is becoming an active member of your community. Many of us that live in anywhere don't know the mayors of the city, the governors, councilors, or any of that stuff, because we get so wrapped up in our days that we don't realize the decisions being made around us and how they affect us, because we've only concentrated here. But it's a big deal. Like elections, presidential elections at the time, that people care about elections, but they forget that the locals happen much. So that's the education piece. The perpetuation, don't perpetuate, involves don't perpetuate stories and narrative that seek to otherize, right? Those Lion King jokes that people made about me those darts or huts, all those things, they might seem funny to your group of people, but what they do is they create insider and outsider dynamics. Not everybody, as you pointed out, will feel confident to be able to tell you to stop, and they'll feel like, oh, it's just fine, I'll just deal with it, and they won't say anything. But no one wants to feel otherwise. So how are you perpetuating that in your media, in your office, in the unwritten rules? And then the other way to stop perpetuation is in the news you spread. We live in an age of disinformation, a lot of fake news, regardless of who you support. But people share a lot of times based on headlines. And there's stats out there that show a lot of headline shares instead of people reading for the content. A lot of people know this. And they just know that it's going to perpetuate and create more echo chambers. So you only are surrounded by people that confirm your beliefs. And the last piece is about learning how to communicate. And that's communicating with people that have different values from you. And my thing here is learn how to open dialogue. You don't have to agree with the person. That's a horn. Hi. You don't have to agree with the person, but always commit to open dialogue. There's a concept in improv that's called yes and, right? So no matter what's being presented to you, you build on it. It's not no but. We need to be able to have more than two options. And even if we disagree, we can do it conversationally, but that doesn't mean that you demean the person because disagree. But that's the concept.
I'm so excited. People need to go grab it.
Yes!
You can get it on everywhere. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, it's available for pre-order, and it comes out on Beyonce's birthday. I mean, September 4th. September 4th, I don't know, it's the same day. I don't know.
You're going to confuse more people thinking that you're African American.
Well, there you go.
Category. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Teo. And everyone, please go get the book. Use your difference to make a difference, and make sure that you are asking yourself this question: am I really doing all that I can to create a diverse and inclusive workplace environment? Well, I don't know about you, but I got so much out of that interview. I think Teo is just a wealth of knowledge, and this is something that is not easy to do, to try and build a diverse and inclusive workforce. So anyone that's out there, I just want to encourage you, keep doing what you're doing and don't be discouraged if you're not where you want to be. Keep looking into different resources. I think it's going to be really valuable for people to check out Teo's new book. It's coming out September 4th. It's called Use Your Difference to Make a Difference, and it's all about cross-cultural relationships. So again, these are different things that you can continually add to your tool belt to keep making your workplace a better and more safe place for your employees. I also encourage you to even check out Teo's podcast. It's really great, and you can find that in the show notes as well. Lastly, I want to encourage you to keep reaching out. I'm so excited to keep hearing feedback from you as listeners. It's been splendid to hear more about what you like, what you don't like, what you're excited to keep hearing about, what topics you've been dying to know more about. Again, it's my job to continually bring you a podcast with information that is specific to company culture. Not just business, but specifically the workplace and its environment, the culture and its people. And so leave us your recommendations for who we should bring onto the podcast, what companies you want to hear more about. I'd love to hear it, and I'm looking forward to you reaching out at culturing.com/podcast. That's culture, EING. Again, I'm so proud of you for making your workplace a better place. This has been Tynan Allen, and I'm so glad to have been hanging out with you. Be blessed.